Hello everybody and welcome to part 1 of the Stop Being Afraid of Houdini supplemental bonus lesson on rigid body destruction and debris sourcing and particle workflows. So in the chapter 6 of the Stop Being Afraid of Houdini course, we specifically devoted that to going over how to get an animation that we had done of a golf club swinging at a golf ball out of Cinema 4D and into Houdini. We did some simulation on it and then export those simulation elements out of Houdini back into Cinema 4D. In the course, we didn't actually go through how we set up any of the simulation stuff. We just kind of worked along with the workflow and then skipped ahead in the project file to, maintain focus on the workflow aspect of round tripping between the two applications. Didn't want to sort of defeat the purpose of the lesson by getting hung up on some gigantic simulation setup. But we thought it would be a good idea to circle back to it at some point because it is something I think people would like to see. Luckily enough for us, the workflow, they've added a couple new options for how we can achieve effects like this in Houdini 18 using the new inline RBD Bullet Solver SOP and also the inline Pyro Solver SOP. And then we'll also be using another PopNet as well. And we'll be doing this all in one network. So if you have access to the course and you have access to the project file, you'll be able to see how the old way of doing this rigid body setup that I did for the purposes of the course. And then you can kind of compare it to this new way, which I think people find really great. I personally have been sort of on the fence and I kind of joke around with my friends about it, but I have not always been a fan of doing things in line in SOPs the way you're about to see me do it in this project. But the more I work with it, the more I think that it actually is really great. So I hope that you'll find this interesting. And again, this is just part 1. So we're just going to be going over our RBD Bullet Solver in this lesson. And then in the next lesson, we'll be going over how to incorporate that with the Pyro Solver to kind of achieve a unified effect. And then beyond that, we'll be creating more debris particles and stuff like that. So without further ado, let's dive into Houdini and see how we can use the new RBD Bullet Solver in SOPs. All right, so here we are in Houdini. We're pretty much where we left off when we imported the file from Cinema. We have our animated alembic in here, our camera move. And then if we jump into our destruction SOP that I've set up here, you can see that we've sort of broken out our incoming alembic into the ball, the club, and the tee. And so now we're ready to do our work here. But because of the new workflows that have come out in Houdini 18, it's a really great opportunity to go over the new inline SOP solver, or the inline Pyro Solver and the inline rigid body solver. Because those two are sort of added. I mean, you could always sort of do these things in line, but they've really sort of created nodes to do this sort of dynamic stuff in the SOPs context in a way that it's a lot more intuitive, and a lot of the controls that you typically used in a more simple setup are exposed for you. So, previously what we ended up with, this is the end of our previous example. We had, when we were bringing our stuff in from our Cinema 4D project, in the section where we're going over how to transfer data back and forth between Cinema 4D and Houdini, what we ended up with at the end of that section was 3 outputs like this, where we have done our rigid body destruction, our pyro simulation, and our particles, all sort of in separate object level nodes like this. But for what we're going to be doing is using these new inline nodes, and we're going to work all inside of this destruction node and build all of our stuff down here. So let's get started with that. The first thing we want to do is we want to fracture the ball, because this golf club is going to come swinging down and it's going to shatter this sphere. So we're going to work with shattering first off. And to do that, I like to use the RBD material fracture node. So let's write down an RBD material fracture. And it always takes a second to think about itself until it is ready to go. And here we are. So we've got a bunch of inputs. We can bring in constraints and proxies and extra Voronoi pieces, etc. And this is a lot like how Vellum is set up now, where you're kind of piping through several separate streams into one node and then doing some work on them and then bringing the separate streams back out, these bottom ones down here. So I'm going to wire the ball into the first input, that's the geometry, and then we're going to just highlight it and see what it does for us. So I zoom in here, you can see that it has kind of added a little bit of a Voronoi fracture look to it. And that's sort of the default what this concrete material type is. There's other glass and wood, but for, I think, just a general destruction, concrete's going to work good for our purposes here. So I'm going to just throw down an exploded view so that we can kind of see what those different pieces look like. And you can see it's just a pretty generic Voronoi fracture pattern. But what we can do is we can actually add some more details to this. So what I like to do is go into this detail tab right here, and then we're going to add some edge detail. If I click on that, you can see that the interior geometry is going to get a little bit more polygonalized, and then these edges have been sort of, they're a little bit warblier now, and you can tell that there's just a little bit more detail. But I want to add I just want to tweak this a little bit to make it look a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to bring the detail size down by a half. So let's do a 0.025. You can see the poly count's going to increase on the inside here. Then I'm going to bring the noise element size down to something like 0.05. That's going to kind of make the noise have a higher frequency. So you can see it's really getting chunky. And then I want to just reduce the height or the amplitude of that noise a little bit as well. So I'm going to bring that down to 0.05. And now you can see we've got some pretty nice little chunks like that. So one of the cool things also about this RBD material fracture is that it's going to give us constraints here, and you can also see an output for proxy geometry. So if I just throw down a null, you can take a look at that. We've got our constraints here. So it's just, these are just the glue constraints that are gluing all of our pieces of our fracture together. And then out of the proxy geometry slot, you can see that it is just leaving us with that normal Voronoi fracture. And actually, there's a pretty cool node. If I go to RBD exploded view, this is a special exploded view that will take all these inputs. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete that. If I click here and then type RBD exploded view, it'll wire up all three for us automatically. Just going to get these out of the way. And then we can actually see our high-res pieces, our proxy, and then if we want to, we can even show how the constraints are all connecting them in this nice, cool exploded view. Cool to know that node's there. I'm just going to get rid of it for now. The next thing that I want to do is add some more detail to this, because if we're looking at our exploded view of our proxy geo, you can see that it's pretty uniformly distributed. And what I want to do is I want to add some more fracture pieces on the side where the golf club is coming through, so that it kind of breaks up a little bit more on one end, on this end where it's initially being struck by the club. So I'm going to do that by adding some more Voronoi cell points. You can see that in this fourth slot is where we're allowed to do that. So I'm going to go up here to the ball, and I'm going to just create a group based off of the normal direction. I'm going to pick put points into that group that are most facing into, it looks like, the positive Z direction. So let's do a group. I'm just going to give myself a little bit more space here. Slide that up. All right, so let's wire this into the first input of the group. You can see it's by default creating a group out of primitives. I'm just going to make a point group instead, and we'll just call this like impact. Impact region, something like that. And I'll remove that slash because I don't want that in there. And instead of using this base group, I'm going to just untick that and then say keep by normals. And then it's already set to point in the positive Z direction. I'm just going to dial the spread angle back. And you can see that those points are starting to kind of stick to that one side. Bring it down to a value of something like 20 looks like it's going to work great. So we've got points that are clustered on that side entering into this group. But I don't want to just like use these points as the fracture points, because those are pretty uniformly distributed. So let me just turn on I'm going to bring up the point size so it's a little bit easier to see. Actually, I don't see, it doesn't look like it's changing that for me. Let's see if I go to guides and then point marker size. Yeah, bring that up. There you can see those orange dots are in our new group here. So what I'm going to do is actually use what I think it's a newer node, but we're going to create an attribute fall off from this grouped region that we created right here to create our higher density distribution we can scatter onto. So to do that, I'm going to use a node called distance along geometry. And the distance along geometry actually will take in a starting point. So we want our impact region to be the start points. So I'm just going to type that in here for our group. and then it's going to output an attribute called dist. And if I middle mouse click here, you can see that it has added that dist attribute here for us. So let's visualize that. I'm actually going to hover over here, and then on the wheel, I'm going to hit this eye. It's going to bring this up, and you can see we have dist here. I'm just going to click it. You can see that it gives us this sort of red, white, and blue fall off for that for the distance from that group. And you can see it also appears here in our visualizers. I'm just going to edit this and make it go from red to black, because I just kind of like I don't know, I'm old school like that. I like my I like my attributes to be visualized on a single color ramp. So I'm just going to set that like that, and you can see that we've got this sort of fall off like that. So now the distance value is increasing as we move away from those points. If we wanted to remap this to a density where our density is higher actually in this area, we need to kind of reverse this a little bit. So I'm going to create a density attribute out of this distance attribute by using a node called attribute, I think it's attribute remap. Yeah, attribute remap. And this is a cool handy node. Basically, you could do something like this in VOPs or in Vex, but this node just makes it really easy to do a pretty basic thing, which is take an attribute, which we're saying our original attribute. I'll just select dist, and we're going to create a new attribute called density. You could probably, you don't need to necessarily rename this. It'll just update the distance attribute, but since I do want to use some more description, a better description of what's determining our scattering, I'm going to use density here. So if I go here, you can see that we have the opportunity to do a range map. And if I open up the geometry spreadsheet, you can see this distance attribute ranges. It looks like something like from 0 all the way up to about 0.4. So what I could do is I could set these values manually, but what it actually has for us here is a nice little compute range button. If I click that, it remaps from the input, which is the input minimum of 0 to 0.41, and remaps it to itself to an output of 0 to 0.1. And I actually want a value from 0 to 1, so I'm going to increase this output maximum. And we can't see anything happening with our visualization in our viewport here because we're not actually visualizing our density attribute anymore. So I'm going to actually, in our visualizers here, I'm going to turn off the distance visualizer, and I'm going to do the same thing with this one. I'm just going to hit the eye, and then I'm going to choose to visualize density by clicking on the density attribute here. And you can see that it's given us another visualizer that is red, white, and blue, and I'm going to edit that one as well. And I'm going to do another, let's do another black to red sort of gradient here. So now that we're visualizing our density, and if we look at our geometry spreadsheet, it looks like our density is actually ranging from 0 all the way up to 1. So it's effectively remapped that for us, which is good. And then I'm just going to ramp this off. Since it gives us this remap attribute here, I'm going to sort of, make it higher. Actually, what we want to do is reverse this. We want the density to be higher here, and then have it sort of fall off from that point. So I'll just kind of tighten this up like that, and then I'll throw down a scatter. So the whole point of this is if I were to just wire the scatter into the ball, it would evenly distribute points all the way around the sphere, but we could provide this density attribute, which will allow it to try and cluster those points closer to higher density values. So if I wire that into our attribute remap, and because we chose density as our attribute, it's clustering all of our points down on this area. And if I were to try and like kind of redistribute that, you can see how it kind of clusters them accordingly. Cool. So what I want to actually do, and I don't know what's going on with this right now. I think I've drifted off of absolute 0 here. So I just have to make sure that this second notch is actually goes down to 0. Otherwise, with a little bit of density in there, it'll keep trying to redistribute those points. So let's put a value of 0 into that second knot. And then I just don't want to scatter as many points. I'm going to put this down to something like 80. And then I like it to be a little bit more random. These points have been relaxed, so I'm just going to turn off these relax iterations. And see they're more randomly kind of scattered there. So now if I put these into the RBD material fracture, highlight the RBD material fracture, it hasn't added any new sort of fracture pieces over here. That's just because we have to enable them. So I'm just going to go back to the primary fracture tab here and just scroll down. You can see that under cell points, it gives us the option to throw in our own points. And I'm just going to click that checkbox. It's going to rethink about it. And there we go. We get some nice gnarly fractures over on that one side, and then they all sort of fade off into more general, larger shapes on the in the negative Z direction. Cool. Now, because RBD material fracture kind of has to think about, it does kind of take a while to cook its results. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw down a node that will cache all this. So it could just do a file cache. But you know what I don't really want to do, I don't want to merge together my geometry and my constraints and my proxies all together into this file cache. That doesn't really work for me. So there's actually a specific cache for this new RBD workflow, and that's called the RBD IO. So I'm just going to throw it on this RBD IO node, and you can see that it's got little points, little sections here where it can take in geometry, constraints, and our proxy geometry, and additional simulation points if we are bringing this out of the simulation, which you'll see in a little bit. So we're only really concerned with caching our initial geometry and constraints and proxy geometry. So I'm just going to do that. All right, so you can see that this node is, by default going to be saving next to our HIP file into a folder called geo, and then it's going to be the name of the file and the operator string and the frame that we're on. We only want to really save the current frame or the first frame, so I'm just going to roll this back to frame 1. You can see that it's got to rethink about cooking this, and that's because there's a time dependency on this because we're importing from an Alembic. So what we could do is if this was being really slow and we were trying to play something back, we could throw it on a time shift. But in terms of doing this, this should kill that time dependency for us. So I'm going to save only the current frame, and I'm going to remove the frame from this list. From this geometry file, because we're only saving the first frame. We're not going to have it change and recalculate every single frame. So when I change that, I'm going to click, I want to name this something that makes sense. We're going to call this RBD fracture cache, and then I'll hit save to disk. It's going to save that to disk, and then I'm going to tick load from disk. And you can see that the time dependency badge, this little clock, has gone away off of that node. So we're not like sitting there recooking our RBD material fracture every single frame. If I go and look at my project folder, it has created the geo folder for me, and inside there is my fracture cache. And it's only one file. It's not too big or anything like that. It's just one file, and it's got all the constraints and everything in there that we need. And so, the thing that's really cool is that we've created our constraints and we've done all this. And in the course, we do go into more detail about how to create constraints manually and all that stuff. But this is really handy. It's kind of done all of that for us right here. So the next thing to do is to punt this into the new RBD solver node that runs in line here in SOPs. So let's throw down that RBD Bullet Solver. And you can see that it has all these different inputs: geometry, constraint, proxy, collision, and guide sim. We're not going to really be dealing with guide sim, but we're going to be doing some stuff with collisions, obviously, because we're going to have to bring in our golf clubs and stuff like that. But if we turn this on, you can see that it starts to think about it. And if I click play, our geometry is falling down and not really doing much of anything, but you can see that it is starting to react to physics. So let's explore this node a little bit. Our RBD Bullet Solver, if we dive inside, we've got an area where we can wire in forces, and then if we pop up here to our DOPNet, you can see that there is a DOPNet in here that just has a bunch of nice defaults that are being exposed to us up here on the SOP level, so that we can kind of control some things that have to do with our sim. And it's set up constraints for us and everything. So if I were to do something like go over to this ground tab under solver ground, we could add in a ground plane. If we click play, our sphere falls and lands on the ground, and there isn't enough energy in that drop for it to break its glue constraints. But if I were to go over to this constraint section here and look at our glue, you can see our glue strength of 1 is there. If I were to bring that down to a smaller value and then let it drop, it should start to break. You can see it starting to do that right there. So for our purposes, I'm just going to put the strength back to 1. Then let's get our collisions in here. I'm going to go up here and grab the club and the T, because I want the club and the T to collide with those fracture pieces. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to merge them together. and then wire them into this fourth input here where it's expecting collision geometry. So I'm just going to bring this down, and because I don't like my wires getting crossed like that, I'm going to throw in a little knot here by option clicking on that stream and just bringing this down a little bit. So here now we've got our collision geo. You can see the T is holding up our ball like that, and then our golf club is going to come through, and it's actually not updating. You can see our golf club should be, let's see if I can, if I go up here, if I highlight our geometry, our bullet solver, you can see our collision geometry appears up here and down here, very small and a little T. But when I click play, nothing is happening. Our template, you can see our template club coming in, but our actual club isn't. And that's because we are actually using deforming collision geometry. So I'm going to go over to my solver and go back to collisions. And here you can see it's doing convex hulls, creating animated static objects. We actually want to use deforming static objects. So now I can go back to frame 0. You can see our golf club comes flying down, and we are back in business here. And it hits our golf ball, and our golf ball starts to break apart and fly across the scene, but it's not quite breaking up just right. And you'd think at this point, oh yeah, we could probably reduce the glue constraint strength and get this to break apart faster. But what I actually want to do, if we look at this, if we just go back and look at our original animation, and I look through our camera, I'm just going to select the original animation camera from up here. We play this back, we actually kind of go, we have a ramp slow-mo. So really when we're simulating, we want to be simulating at a lower time scale. And this is also going to address another issue. If you notice, the ball starts to roll off the tee the first couple frames. Well, because we're going to be doing our simulation in such slow motion, we're not really going to notice that. We could do something like constrain it to the tee. It's just not going to be necessary for this type of thing. We could also deactivate it so it doesn't roll and then activate it right before a collision happens. Plenty of ways around that. But in this example, what we're going to do is we're just going to change the time scale. So if we go back up here under our solver, our time scale is set to 1. We want to set it to 0.01. So we're going to go 100th of the, we're going to scale time by 100. So we're doing like 100 times slow-mo on this. So if we click play, that ball is more or less staying in place. And because of the way velocity is calculated, that golf club is moving much slower by the time it hits that golf ball, and the golf ball shatters into a billion pieces. So if I go back here, we can kind of see that that golf ball just gets destroyed into a bunch of pieces, but they're also floating in sort of a slow motion-y kind of way. So that's looking good. I'd say, even at this point, it looks like we might be done with this. I think that the pieces could move a little bit slower, so I'm actually going to add a little bit of drag. And luckily for us, drag is one of those things that SideFX has also added to the top level control of this bullet solver. If we go over to our forces tab here, you can see that there's a little drag checkbox here. So I'm just going to turn that on, and let's see what the air resistance is set to 0.0075. We'll see if that actually does anything. It seems like a really low value. I'm not noticing much, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer to the project that I did before, and it looks like I set this to a value of about 0.5. So I'm going to put down 0.5 in here, and let's just go back into our camera. And that's looking better to me. It's looking like it's moving just a little bit slower, a little bit easier to see what's going on. Kind of feels like that ramp slow-mo we're after. Cool. So the next thing we want to do is we want to cache this out. So like we had before, this RBD IO cache, that's really cool. It's a really handy node, but we don't really need our constraints or anything after this. We just kind of want to have this nice high-res geo, and you can see that we get that coming out of this first input. And then we also get our constraint geometry. We also get our proxy geometry if we wanted to. But then this fourth one, we actually get simulation points. And I'm like, well, what are those simulation points? Well, I'm just going to take this. I'm going to borrow this null that we were using before so I can kind of view that. Simulation points come through. I'm just going to split this pane top bottom so I can look at my geometry spreadsheet under Inspectors Geometry Spreadsheet. And you can see that these points that are coming out of the bullet solver, they all have sort of they have all these orientation attributes, pivots, and everything that we would need to instance geometry back onto those points. But because they're simply just little tiny points, they should cache and store very much less information than they would if we were caching this high-res geometry every frame. So I'm going to actually run a cache on these points instead, and then what we can do is we can actually instance our original pieces back onto them. So to illustrate this, I'm just going to throw down a transform pieces. And this is a handy node that SideFX has created for kind of doing this thing. You can take these points and wire them into the template point section here and then grab your original geometry. So this is before the simulation. These are just our fracture pieces as they are statically sitting here. This will know by its name attribute to translate those pieces onto the points in the simulation. And here we have this really nice fast cache, this lightweight cache that we're going to do. We cache these points out, and then we're going to instance our geometry back onto those points. So let's just cache out these points real quick so we don't need to have them anymore, or we don't need to simulate anymore. I'm just going to throw it on a file cache. So I'm going to do a file cache instead of this RBD fracture cache. And we're just going to wire this in here, and I'm going to call this the RBD sim points. And then I'm going to save it. I like to save it into a cache folder next to my file, so I'm going to call this cache. So I like to use geo folder for a geo that's going into something or going to be used in something, you know, like a initial fracture. But then I like to use cache to actually store simulations and stuff like that. Then I like to put it inside of a couple more folders because usually I have more than one cache. So I'm going to go $OS for the operator string, then $hip name to act sort of as my version, and then leave the rest as it is. And we've changed the project range from 0 to 72. That's good, and that should be good. I'm just going to click Save to Disk. Now, if I pull up my cache here, you can see our RBD sim points cache. We've done this whole cache like this, and it is only 2 megabytes. And that's incredibly small. I think when I did this before, when I did this before and I cached out all the geometry, including the high-res geometry, it was on the order of like 180 megabytes. And for a small example like this, it's really not that big of a deal. But if you're working with a lot heavier geometry, that's going to be sort of something you're going to want to keep an eye on. And this is a really handy way of doing that. Just caching out those little points, it makes things a lot easier to deal with in the end. So I'm going to turn this, check this load from disk option and wire this in here. And let's get rid of that null. We don't need it anymore. We don't need this exploded view. And let's just line these up nicely, like so. And here we have our cache, like that. So the next thing I could do is throw down a null. And we have done the initial fracturing part of this lesson. I'll call this out RBD sim, and I will give it a color of purple, noting that I like to kind of color my nodes that have to do with, you know, the pipeline out to rendering. I like to make them purple. So I'm going to make this one purple. I'm going to hop out here and then throw down a new geo node. And just kind of store the render geometry in here so that I can, you know, if we wanted to render it or export it, we could just have it out here. So I'm just going to throw down this node. I'm going to say RNDR RBDs. And then we'll throw in an object merge and just grab from our destruction sim the out RBD sim, accept, and there we have it. Make this guy purple. And we'll just leave it as is and dive back into our destruction. Cool. So we've done our destruction here. I'm going to just sort of, let's just put a nice little net box around this to note that this is the RBD stuff. So RBD, and I'll give it a nice color. Maybe we'll do this, maybe we'll do like a yellow. So RBD sim. And now we can take this and do the next part. What we want to do is create debris such as volumetric and particle debris. So we're going to start off with volumetric debris. to start this whole thing off with 3 bold words. Houdini is easy. I am here to tell you that you are in the right place. Stay tuned. Do some particle simulations, some fluid simulations, just all the simulations. Let's just run this again. For all of you who are like me, who love computers and graphics and animation, you got this! An introduction to Houdini for motion designers and Cinema 4D artists looking to expand their skills. My apologies for the lame recording. I'm making this up as I go. You really do need to know what this stuff is to do the cool things. Sooner or later, your brain is going to start making connections. You came, you conquered, you saw. And congratulations for making it this far. Why didn't I know this existed? Cheers. I'm proud of you, and I'm a little bit emotional now, I'm not gonna lie. Stop being afraid of Houdini! Without further ado, let's let the learning begin.